Welcome to ARVN, Amateur Radio Video News. The program you're about to see is free to watch, courtesy of YouTube. Thanks, YouTube. But it wasn't free to make. ARVN's got a lot of money invested in video equipment like this sweet camera and that editing system back there. And it takes a lot of time to shoot and edit a program like this. So I'm asking you to make a voluntary payment, contribution, whatever you want to call it. Just stop by our website, arvn.tv, and you'll see a link to make that payment, whatever you think the program is worth to you. I guess you could say that this program is brought to you by you. So thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the FCC Forum. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. There seems to be a lot of things that you're interested in. Riley has some comments to make after I'm through. I realized this morning that this is my 19th year here at Dayton, coming on behalf of the Commission. I've also seen a lot of you around the forum today, or around the Hamvention today, that I've seen before in past years, and it suddenly dawned on me that just like me, none of you have gotten any older. I'm really glad to see that. Every year something happens here that just kind of, it makes you wonder. It makes you, just kind of, it puts a perspective on ham radio that you only find at Dayton. And yesterday I was out in the room over here. There was this guy that had this backpack on. And I thought, okay, well, backpacks, that's fine. Except the back of this was a huge heat sink. And he had this big antenna sticking up on the back, and he was trying to come through doors like this. And it was kind of like watching an old guy do the Watusi to get that antenna down so it could come through. He comes up to me and he hands me this card and he says, "I've just had my amplifier certified." I thought, okay, where's this headed? I can't resist something like that. I said, "Well, what do you mean it was certified?" "Well, I took it over to this place. It was one of the manufacturers. I don't want to use their name, but it's the first letter of the Greek alphabet. And he hands me this card, and on the back, he'd had it certified for 2,089 watts output. I'm thinking, how often are you given an open and shut case right in your hand? So, okay, well, his question, I looked at this and I said, obviously, I'm thinking to myself, obviously that watt meter at Alpha is wrong. And, why don't they just put something like full power or something, 2,089 watts. Now mind, this is on his back, okay? I'm thinking, RF field strength, things like this. And then he says, "Do you still work for the FCC?" Well, yeah, no doubt about it. I'm at Dayton. Strange things happen around here.
His feet are getting warm because he's the counterpoise. I have a photograph of him.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm just going to be curious how much hair he has left at the end of the weekend. My name is William Cross, as many of you know. I work in the mobility division of the FCC's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau is the office in the FCC that is responsible for oversight of the amateur service. On the air, I'm W3TN. With me today is the Commission's Special Counsel for Amateur Radio Enforcement, Riley Hollingsworth, and he'll be talking about the enforcement activities in a few minutes. I want to offer a special thanks to Dayton and the Hamvention for making it possible for Riley and me to be here. I also want to thank them very much for leaving Riley and me up here only an hour this year. In the mobility division, we handle the day-to-day administration of the amateur service and some of the rulemaking activities that affect the amateur radio service. The division also has staff members in our Gettysburg, Pennsylvania office. The Gettysburg staff is the staff that handles most of your applications. They handle other licensing matters, and they deal with the Universal Licensing System, or ULS as it is known. Within the Commission, other bureaus also make rules that affect you. Our Office of Engineering and Technology handles spectrum allocations and equipment issues. Our Managing Director's Office is the office that handles matters related to fees, such as the fees for the vanity call signs. Debt Collection Improvement Act matters, the need for those things you see called FRNs or Federal Registration Numbers comes through our Managing Director's office. Today I want to divide my comments into two main areas. First, I want to talk about some proceedings where the Commission has issued a decision. And secondly, rulemaking requests that have been filed with us, but which are pending resolution by the Commission. The past year has been kind of an interesting year because it's been a fairly quiet year on the regulatory front. We haven't had any big rulemaking items come out. We have wrapped up a couple of ones that were pending, and it doesn't look like, at least in the near future, there will be anything else coming out. Obviously, at this time in the year and for the next few months, we're going to be very much involved in the national elections and politics. Basically, it's a very good time to be flying below the radar. And that's where ham radio is right now in terms of the big picture. We're below the radar. The first major decision I want to talk about was the reconsideration item that came out in 2008, in February of this year, that was the decision in the no-code proceeding. This was the docket 05-235. No rule changes were made in that decision. As most of you know, the big part of that decision was that it eliminated the Morse code requirement for operator licenses. Now, two individuals petitioned for reconsideration of this decision. One individual argued that Morse code proficiency requirements should be retained for the amateur extra class license so that amateur operators can act as a strategic reserve because there is no assurance that voice or digital modes will even be operationally viable in future emergency communications environments. The Commission turned this request down because there was no showing that eliminating the telegraph proficiency requirement will affect national security or emergency communications. Remember that when we had a Morse code requirement in the federal regulations, that requirement came from the international radio regulations. Prior to 2003, there was an international requirement that for any operator that had HF privileges, you had to prove that you could, quote, send by hand and receive by ear texts in the international Morse code. After 2003, the international requirement disappeared. The requirement was never based on emergency communications capability, national security, or the unreliability of other types of communication systems. The other individual that requested reconsideration wanted us to reopen the comment period because he encountered difficulty in getting his comments and reply comments into the electronic comment filing system. The Commission turned him down because many of the 3,900 comments and reply comments expressed the same views as he did, so the substance of his views was considered. And when we checked ECSF, his comments were in there. The second item that I want to mention is commonly referred to as the Miller Order. This is an order that was released May 7th. It dismissed a petition for rulemaking we received from Mark Miller, N5RFX. This petition requested three different things. First, that we change the definition of data that's in Part 97 of your rules to delete language that he had requested we add in 2003 and which we did in a 2006 order. Second, he wanted to limit the subbands that automatically controlled digital stations are permitted to transmit on to only those subbands that were specified in Section 97.221. And lastly, he wanted to amend the rules to divide the CW-RTTY data bands into 1.5 and 2.4 kilohertz segments. The effect of these changes, when taken together, would have been, as he said, a small number of wider bandwidth modes, including PACTOR 3, would no longer be authorized. End of quote. Translating that into English, what he was asking for was bye-bye WinLink. Now, don't get me wrong here. WinLink as a communication system seems to have become the Brussels sprouts of ham radio. You either love it or you hate it. And trying to bury it under ketchup or hollandaise sauce hasn't changed the basic like or dislike for WinLink. Most of the controversy here seems to swirl around how certain licensees use it. Some use it for a radio email system. Others use it for getting weather maps while they are on sailboats in places the brave dare not go. Others use it for their personal business activities, such as buying and selling stocks. These uses are really a Section 97-113, a prohibited communications question, not a technology question. The rules apply to the control operator of the station transmitting the message, not the WinLink system. As we have said until we are blue in the face, in the amateur service, we do not license or regulate systems. We license stations. And it is the station licensee that is responsible for the proper operation of the station. If it's your call sign on the transmission, it's your responsibility. The request that we limit the subbands that automatically controlled digital stations are permitted to transmit on to only those specified in 97.221 was curious, because the rules as they are today limit transmissions from these stations to a bandwidth of no more than 500 cycles or hertz on frequencies authorized for RTTY and data emissions outside of those automatically controlled subbands when a locally or remote controlled station is interrogating that automatic station. If the idea behind this request was to limit these stations to the subbands to minimize interference, we were not persuaded that limiting stations that were transmitting in response to interrogation by a station where there was a control operator present would cause increased interference, because these stations are already limited to a 500 hertz bandwidth. We also noted that the requested limit is less than the limit, or that the current limit in the rules is less than the limit that was requested in the petition. The third item that came out had to do with 2 meters. We received a request from 2 hams out in California, Ken Chafin and Leon Brown. What they wanted was for us to change so that a little more spectrum, 300 kilohertz, would be authorized for repeater stations. Currently, repeaters can use 3 of the 4 megahertz in your 2-meter band. They claimed that additional spectrum was needed for repeater stations because some amateur repeater stations have begun certain digital communications protocols, and digital voice operation is incompatible with the existing analog operations, because digital voice users are unable to determine if a desired frequency is in use by an analog station. Inadvertently, they said, digital systems can cause harmful interference to analog systems. They also claimed that coordinating groups have been unable to separate analog and digital voice repeater operations because the available repeater spectrum in the 2-meter band is fully occupied by existing analog systems. Now, as I mentioned, repeaters are prohibited from using 2 500 kilohertz segments of the 2-meter band in order to minimize harmful interference to other amateur service stations and operating activities. Believe it or not, some licensees use 2 meters for things other than repeater operation. The petition was turned down because their request would likely result in increased interference to other operations such as packet, moon bounce, and simplex type operations. This request also raises questions about the frequency coordinator's role in frequency management. Frequency coordinators are groups that recommend receive transmit channels, and they also recommend associated operating and technical parameters in order to avoid or minimize potential interference. Coordinators can create more channels by, for example, requiring as a condition of coordination that the repeater, before they coordinate a repeater, that a narrower than 25 kilohertz bandwidth be used. They can establish that narrower guard bands be used, or that a repeater not be installed on a mountaintop where it ties up a channel for half the area of a state. Coordinators can set aside certain parts of a band for digital systems if you all are willing to stand for it. They can refuse, under recommending associated operating parameters, to coordinate closed repeaters. And they can pull a coordination recommendation from a licensee if the licensee doesn't comply with the terms of the coordination. Coordinators also should be sure that the systems they have coordinated are still using the channels before they tell you that your system can't be coordinated. From what I have heard, in some areas of the country, there are an awful lot of paper repeaters and an awful lot of out-of-date coordinations. Another thing that you need to remember when it comes to repeaters and coordination is that coordination is not required to put a repeater on the air. Coordination only becomes relevant if there is interference. If you can find a channel that is unused, the rules allow you to put a repeater on it. If a channel is coordinated to a closed repeater and you can use it without causing interference, you may. Coordination doesn't establish a squatter's right to a frequency or a right to exclude others. Just as there is no I in Army, there is no my in all frequencies are shared. The claim that the 2-meter band is fully occupied has to be looked at very carefully. Many times, the band in a particular location or at a particular time is only fully occupied on paper. Another group of petitions we received last year asked for changes in the station identification rules. We addressed these petitions in an order that came out in July of last summer. One petitioner, basing his request on local repeater operations, wanted the once every 10-minute part of the rule changed to once every 30 minutes. We put this out for comment to see how you all felt about it. We got over 100 comments, and the overwhelming majority of you expressed the belief that the current rule properly balances the burden of requiring the station to transmit its call sign with the convenience of those receiving the transmissions. The request was dismissed. Another petitioner requested that we change the station identification rule back to what it was in the late 50s by requiring a station to transmit its call sign and the call sign of the station it was communicating with at the beginning and end of the message. And he wanted us to require the use of specific words, such as "this is" on phone or "DE" on CW when identifying. Again, we got over 100 comments. Most of them opposed the petition. We agreed that increasing the frequency of station identification as he proposed was unnecessary. It would be burdensome and could lead to congestion at times, such as during contests or during a de-expedition. The petition also did not demonstrate that revising the station identification requirement as it requested would address the primary problem of the petitioner. His claim was that many amateur operators do not identify their stations timely or at all. Again, this was based primarily on repeater operations, this time in Texas. The petition was dismissed. QCWA wanted certain letter combinations reserved so that stations may be identified as that of a veteran. We found the requested rule change was not needed because amateur radio operators who are current or honorably discharged members of the military already could identify their stations as QCWA requested. The present rule permits a control operator to include an indicator with the call sign, subject only to the limitation that the self-assigned indicator not conflict with any other indicator specified in the Commission's rules or with any prefix assigned to another country. So that petition was dismissed also. The last petition I want to mention is one that we received from a group that called itself Hams for Action. It wanted us to take another look at the 1985 PRB decision and subsequent requests to expand its scope. It proposed that the Commission exempt CC&Rs, preempt from CC&Rs antennas only when the amateur operator is an emergency communications operator, and it proposed specific guidelines to define reasonable accommodation. Their proposal was denied because the distinctions it claimed did not address the Commission's primary reason for excluding CC&Rs from its limited preemption policy, and that is that CC&Rs are private contractual arrangements that the Commission is reluctant to interfere with. As the Commission reiterated in 2001, it is reluctant to preempt private parties' freedom to contract unless it is shown that the private agreements will seriously disrupt the federal regulatory scheme, or unless there is strong countervailing reasons to do so. So where do we stand on PRB 1? In 2001, after the ARRL had made 3 unsuccessful runs at the goal line, the Commission said the scope of the limited preemption policy of PRB 1 for amateur radio stations remains applicable only to regulations of state, county, municipal, and other local governing bodies, and is not applicable to homeowners association bylaws and architectural control committee regulations. It also said, however, should Congress see fit to enact a statutory directive mandating expansion of our reasonable accommodation policy, we would expeditiously act to fulfill our obligation under the congressional directive. What about the future? There are some things coming down the pike that you want to keep track of. Some of these items are rulemaking requests that have been filed with us, but which have not yet been acted on. The ARRL has a pending petition, it's RM 11325, that requests that we amend the rules that apply to the power stations may use when transmitting spread spectrum emissions. Now, BPL. I'm sure that you all know that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals remanded the FCC's final BPL rules. The court did not vacate the rules, so they are still in effect. But there will be another proceeding to address what the court told the Commission it had to address. We have a request for clarification from the Northern California Packet Association that asks what we mean by the word simultaneously as it is used in the definition of a repeater. The issue here is that in California, D-Star repeaters have been coordinated on channels that are set aside for auxiliary stations on the basis that because there is a delay in retransmission of the signal, the retransmission is not simultaneous, and therefore the repeating station is not a repeater. Others have advanced a variant of the duck argument. If the station looks like a repeater, if it functions like a repeater, and it sounds like a repeater, it should be treated as a repeater and confined to the repeater's subbands. A look at the report and order the Commission put out in a previous docket, it was docket 93-85, will shed some light on this issue. And a decision on that will be coming shortly. OET is working on an ARRL petition that requests we swap one channel in the 60-meter band for another one. You will probably be seeing that within the next few months. As I mentioned, our Office of Managing Director handles the vanity call sign application fee. It has proposed to raise that fee from $11.70 to $12.30. And you will probably see a decision coming on that later this summer. This being an election year, there doesn't seem to be any legislation on Capitol Hill that is of direct interest or impact on the amateur service. Other issues seem to have bumped you all from center stage. Now, with that, I've kind of summarized for you what's happened in the past year as far as regulatory activities at the Commission. We will have a chance to take some questions for you, and we're looking forward to that. But before we get to your questions, we are fortunate to have with us again Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH. Riley is the Special Counsel for Amateur Radio Enforcement in the Enforcement Bureau. As you know, Riley was thinking about retiring last year, and in a moment of weakness, he scared you all to death. What you don't know is that I had been privileged to these thoughts of delusional insanity. And we had a number of conversations about this very, very poor idea. I think the turning point was when I asked him, and what are you going to do sitting at home during a Pennsylvania winter, overlooking the estate covered with snow, not being able to go anywhere, watching the electric meter spin as you try to stay warm? The next Monday, he pulled back the papers. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions for them, particularly for Riley. Any questions about his retirement will get you assigned to use only 14275. And we will give you a new call sign. It starts with 3 letters and has 4 numbers after it. I know there is a great deal of interest in what Riley has been up to over the past year and what the Commission has been doing on the enforcement front. So, Riley, it's your turn.
First of all, a couple of preliminaries. If anybody's cell phone goes off, I'm not here. Second thing, Bill told me years ago that this job would be like a beauty pageant judge, that no matter what kind of job you did every year, about 49 more people would hate your guts. And I think one of them must be with the Dayton Hamvention that gave me this, K4ZKH.
Oh, I've been meaning to tell you about that.
Yeah, well, we'll find him. We'll find him. There's got to be DNA on here somewhere. Thank you for coming. This annual migration to Dayton never ceases to amaze me. It's very tiring, and every year for all of us, and every year when I'm headed home, I'm thinking, well, I think I'll sit next year's out. But then about 2 weeks, I start looking forward to coming again, and I see the same equipment every year, the same used equipment, the same connectors, the same wire ties, the same antennas, the same vintage equipment, and I try to look at every one every year. And it just occurs to me how fortunate we are to appreciate the magic of radio. We need to realize the debt that we owe to those who work so hard to further the goals of amateur radio, whether it's the emergency communications participants, club members, teachers, VEs, the league. And I want to say congratulations to Ward Silver, Tom McDermott, and Emery McClendon, the Hamvention Award winners. And we thank you very much for what you contribute to amateur radio on a daily basis. One of the richest rewards in doing something is to experience joy in doing it. And with so many people working so hard on their own time to further the goals of amateur radio, we're all a little more free to enjoy radio and to make it fun as well as a public service. We're indeed fortunate to experience in every contact just a little bit of the thrill of our first contact. And it's not about making money, it's about life and contributing something during the short time that we have. A lot of you don't realize how valuable your radio activities are. I just came from a SHARES conference in Virginia, which is a federally sponsored program, and REACT was there as well as NOAA, the Hurricane Watch Network, the National Communications System, the League was there, National Weather Service, Saturn, SHIPCOM, and Skywarn. Everyone represented there had integral ties to amateur radio. And I had never known this, but the National Weather Service is particularly tied into amateur radio through the Skywarn program because all of their weather stations are located only at airports. I never knew this, so they have many, many areas of the country that are not covered. Now, before I get to enforcement, what do I bring you every year? A couple of stories about what was alleged to be deliberate interference. So the two I picked out of the pile for this year, I'm going to give you very briefly. One, the complaint came in, experiencing radio interference with our pilot control lighting system, garage doors, RF camera. FAA facilities checked radio frequency on the tower and said they're right on. They mentioned the possibility of a rogue tower being somewhere and causing interference on our navigational aid lighting. There are no harmonics on the tower frequency that the FAA uses. So we sent this to the field, and about 4 days later, 4 or 5 days, I got curious about it, hadn't heard anything, so I sent the complainant an email and said, you heard from somebody on this, right? So the email came back, yes, we found a bad water well on a feedlot. The the Maritime Mobile Net had a MFSK station right on top of 14300 not too long ago. They heard the call sign. They sent the person a message and the email back, yes, that was me operating MFSK on the 14300 Maritime Net. I thought it was transmitting into a dummy load. I had the rig's AF control turned down. After a few moments, I then turned the audio up when I heard the control operator mention digital station on frequency. I was too shaken to key the mic. Now, and please accept my sincere apologies for the mistaken interference. Now, what was notable about this was the approach that the Maritime Mobile Service Net took. And this is pretty classy, I think. He had identified with a call sign, so they sent an email to him saying, today, May 29th, we had MFSK signals interfering with net operations from such and such time. Your call sign was picked up calling WD8ESQ. If this was your station, we'd greatly appreciate your not coming up with digital modes on 14300. However, you are most welcome to come by and listen or check in on single sideband. Although Maritimes have priority, we welcome all and really try to provide a beneficial service to those who need it as well. If this was not your station, we're probably looking at someone bootlegging your call. In either case, please feel free to check in to the Maritime Mobile Service Net on sideband and have a great holiday weekend. Now, they didn't make any references to his heritage, no references to his mom, or his puny signal, or his radio abilities. They gave him the benefit of the doubt, and it was an honest mistake. I see this every day. Now, to enforcement generally, you'll notice at the Commission strong enforcement across the board if you've been watching our websites. Recently, there was a $2,500,000 forfeiture for unsolicited faxes sent by the Hot Lead Company, sent faxes to over 150 customers after being warned. They didn't respond to the Commission or to customer complaints. You may have seen the $248,000 forfeiture to Toys R Us for not having consumer alert labels about televisions not having DTV tuners. You may have seen the item related to the CV shop, $7,000 for offering non-certified CV transceivers, and the K1CRA radio store got a citation for advertising the sale of non-certified transmitting equipment. And I think that was bought at a Hamfest, if I recall right. Now, in a citation, it may not sound like much just getting a citation instead of a forfeiture, but if a citation is ignored, there's $1,000 or $11,000 for each violation or each day of continuing violations. Over the past year, you've seen a number of audits in the amateur radio area of claims made for call signs that were claimed as a relative of a former holder. And I want to tell you some of these explanations we considered sending to the Comedy Channel. So be very careful when you do that. And keep in mind that before we even start one of these cases, we allow enough time for license plates and QSL cards to be ordered. Just a little enforcement enhancer. You should have seen the citations to electric utility companies, namely the Lubbock, Texas utility and Excel out in Lubbock, Texas, for a long-running problem with radio frequency interference that they just would not address, and apparently were depending on the Commission to find it for them. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but for some reason they sent their response to a television station who knew nothing about these two utilities companies being cited. So they ran a big story on it, and then people came out of the woodwork with YouTube videos. One fellow sent in a video of the power line that had fallen in his backyard and set his backyard on fire. He had made 4 or 5 complaints to the utility company, and it just got out of hand from there. And so that was worth many hundreds of hours of enforcement, those 2 television programs. You see a lot of repeater stay-off letters. We try to help repeater operators maintain control of their system. Now, some repeater owners seem to think that a repeater has some special status or some kind of sacred status in the Commission's rules. It doesn't. It's an amateur radio station like any other. There's no such thing as an unattended automatic station, but that's the way some of the repeaters are run. We help you with that, but you've got to understand that first. And when you try to get somebody off and you send them a letter and they won't stay off, we send what's called a repeater stay-off letter. You probably see 3 or 4 of those every month. You've heard a lot over the last 6 months about pave pause. A lot of repeaters in California had to shut down or drastically reduce power. And we're trying to help you in pave pause because the first list that the Air Force came in with was based on out-of-date repeater directories. Amateur operators got 440 as shared spectrum by willing to be secondary to the Air Force. So we can't cause interference, and we've got to cooperate. There were hundreds and hundreds of 440 repeaters in California that were interfering with the radar system at Beale Air Force Base. Everyone was cooperative. We contacted almost 150 of them. Now, just because the Air Force says that there's interference doesn't mean that we accept that for face value. There's a process that has to be gone through to determine and to assure that the repeater does cause interference. But that took up an incredible amount of time. And there was also a pave pause issue in Cape Cod that was resolved quickly. And the League helped very much in all of these cases by sending out all of the preliminary letters to the repeater licensees explaining what the issues were and how they could go about mitigating the repeater signal. So we owe the League a debt of gratitude for helping with that too. I'm waiting any day now on the results of the second round of monitoring from the Air Force. I heard from them about a week ago saying that they'd found 18 repeaters that weren't identifying. That's a simple thing to resolve, but they said nothing about any number of repeaters that might be interfering. So I'm hoping that that's a good sign that it's very manageable this time and that we might have maybe 30 or 40 repeaters to contact rather than 140 something from the first round. So I hope to get that information Monday or Tuesday. Things have calmed down a lot in the amateur radio service, but the breadth of enforcement commission-wide can be seen every day on our website. But you know, when it comes to the amateur radio service, there's one enforcement tool we need very badly, and we just don't have it, and that's straitjackets. We not only don't have them, we don't have any authority to require you to wear them if we did find them. Some days I just want to ask, why can't everybody just get along? And I preach at you every time I talk to you about this, but it can't be overstated. Specifically, some things I've noticed in the 75 and 80 meter phone band has been expanded, but a lot of these regular small groups, rag chews, and some of the nets should consider spreading out because a lot of the regular operations every night are clumped together. And there's still interference issues and interference allegations. But if everybody would spread out a little bit, and that's going to take a real change of habit by a group that has used the same frequency for 40 years to talk across the state. But you really need to spread out and take advantage of that expansion of the 75 and 80. Interest in code, to me, seems to be higher than ever before. I would remind you that only 1% of licensees filed any comments in the no code proceeding. But it seems to me that interest is peaked, and I see the new code keys that are for sale out here, and I always see a big crowd of people around anything related to code or code keyers and so forth. I think the interest in it has really peaked. I noticed no difference whatsoever in enforcement problems related to no code. And I think I'm seeing more young people at the events that I go to. And I noticed this fellow sitting right here, and you're a licensee, I hope. Otherwise, I've stood up here and made a fool of myself. But I'm gambling. I'm gambling this W2 CVZ. And when did you get your license?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. And how old are you? 12. If I'd been that smart at this age, I never would have gone with the government. At that age, I never would have gone with the government. But Future president of the league might be sitting right there. But that's our future right there, and we're depending on you. We need a lot more young people, and I think that the code seems to interest young people because hopefully they're getting tired of instant messenger and the internet and so forth. Last night somebody told me about a 14-year-old net control operator on a national net. BPL speaks for itself. I can't say anything about that. But we do need more courtesy on the bands. We still need more courtesy. This fighting among yourselves is the worst thing that you can do. You've got some very important issues coming up in the future, whether it's ALE. What's the other one that we're dealing with? It's ALE, and I don't remember what the name of that other technology was. D-Star, ALE, D-Star, and there's one other technology that's on the horizon too. And so you don't need any infighting. You need to stick together. You have some poor operators and rude operators and operators who don't care and who are hateful and bitter about life in general, but every group has that, whether it's doctors, electricians, lawyers, plumbers, whatever, bankers. Everybody has a certain percentage of people like that in these times. But what you have to do and remind yourself every day is stay on the high road and report to us if you can't resolve a problem after you've given it a chance to go away. You'd be amazed at the number of complaints I get that seem to be good complaints, and they are good complaints on the face of it, but if I check on them a few days later or a week or so later, the problem has gone away, which tells me a lot of it is unintentional or somebody having second thoughts. Your group is not immune from the trends of society generally, and we of course want amateur radio to be a cross-section of society. The overall compliance is outstanding in the amateur radio service, but never let the commission get by again with handing you 10 to 12 years of neglect. You have to stay vigilant. Even though the bands may sound better to you, you have to stay vigilant to protect your service and be part of the solution, not the problem, and operate as if the whole world is listening, because generally it is. There are plenty of ugly situations in the world, and you don't have to add to them. Now, there are a few idiots in your service who know all the answers only because they haven't thought of all the questions. So all I can say about them, again, all groups have those people. They just want recognition and reaction. Don't give it to them. Don't be baited. Most of all, don't be baited. Don't feel insulted. They are their own worst punishment. And don't dignify them with a response to what they're trying to do. I'm convinced that some people get up in the morning every day determined to resent something or someone. You have a great service overall, and it's a major underpinning of the communication system in this country, and you demonstrate that on a daily basis. And we thank you all for the way you help us with enforcement and in your radio service, and every thank you that you give us, believe me, is deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Now, we'll take questions. At some point, the guys from the Dayton Amateur Radio Club will open the back doors, we hope, and that will signify that it'll be time for the next forum to come in. But we'll try to get your questions answered as best we can within that time. So, who would like to ask the first question?
Riley and Bill, you've both said something that taken together might be considered just a little contradictory. And I know that isn't what you intended, so I'd like to hear how it isn't. Bill, you said earlier that it would be entirely permissible for a frequency coordinator to say, "Thou shalt not give priority and coordination to closed repeaters," or as part of regulating the parameters of repeater operation. And yet Riley said that if a repeater owner tells people that they need to stay off his repeater, that the commission will back that up. Now, and it's common wisdom in the amateur community, and Riley, please tell me if you've been misquoted, because I didn't hear you say this, but it's been common wisdom that, quote, Riley says that all repeaters are closed repeaters, unquote, because the repeater operators have the duty, authority, whatever, to tell people thou shalt not operate on the repeater. That may be an overstatement. That's fine if it is. But even if that is, If you can tell somebody not to operate on your repeater, and yet it's permissible to say you can't coordinate closed repeaters, how do those two fit together?
They fit together because they're two different things. What you're referring to is the rule in 97.205 that says specifically, let's see. It's 97.205 paragraph E. Limiting the use of a repeater to only certain user stations is permissible. Now, you will not find the term closed repeater anywhere in Part 97. That's a term that you all have developed. This rule was adopted at the request of the amateur community so that a repeater owner, operator, control operator would be able to tell a particular licensee, stay off the repeater. And usually, our experience has been that comes as pretty much as a last resort. It's someone that's just misbehaving. They're, carrying on, baiting people, making, unidentified transmissions, other things that are just, to be polite, maybe in the category of totally obnoxious. And as a group, the club, they don't want that person on the repeater. So in the rulemaking proceeding, the comments came in and said, we need to be able to have some kind of authority to tell someone to stay off the repeater. This rule gives you that authority. And it was basically a situation that came out of a North Carolina repeater back in the 80s. Now, a frequency coordinator does not have authority to tell someone you can't be a repeater. What their authority is to recommend technical standards and operating conditions, or operating parameters. And you have to remember, coordination is not a right. Coordination is something that it is given with the goal of helping to minimize interference. It's not required, and the coordinator develops standards. Hopefully those standards reflect the views of what the repeater users in that area want. So coordinators have to have standards to decide, can we coordinate this repeater or not? They're two completely different things. The coordinators are sitting there trying to figure out, how can we make efficient use of these frequencies? Well, that involves a lot of, kind of decisional making stuff. What frequency spacings do we want? Height above average terrain? Do we want, what bandwidth are we willing to coordinate? If someone comes in and says, I want a repeater coordination, but I want it only for this group of people, which is usually what you mean by a closed repeater. We want it, just for a very limited group of people. The coordinator can say, no, our standards require that a repeater be open to anyone that's used. Or if they can say, yes, we can do that, we will do that, but it has to be tone accessible by this frequency so that anyone driving through the area can access the repeater. They can, and this is up to the coordinators. The standards for coordination are not in Part 97. They're developed by the coordinators individually. So it's kind of really two different things, and that's why they're not inconsistent.
I would add too that since a repeater owner is responsible for the operation of the repeater and the compliance with the rules, if we told you that you didn't have the authority to keep somebody off of it, that means that if you had a person on there that was engaging in rule violations all the time, you would have to shut it down, and that would put the control of your repeater in their hands. So as a first alternative, or first remedy, you can direct them to stay off the repeater. That allows you to have control of it. And if they don't do it, then we come in. But that's totally different from a closed system. Some repeaters are closed really just to keep crazy people off, frankly. I think that's, you see a lot of that in certain parts of the country, but not too much out here.
Riley, have you received any complaints about digital repeaters transmitting in the 145.5 to 145.8 range? And if you have, how do you handle them?
The question is whether we've gotten any complaints about digital repeaters. Are you referring to D-Star?
Could be, could be P25, could be anything, probably D-Star, but in that 145.5 to .8 range.
It seems to me we have, I don't know the specifics though. It seems to me I've heard some rumbling about that in the last few weeks, but we haven't gotten to it. Any other questions? Over here.
We recently, when you opened up 80 meters down in the 3600 and 3700 range, We've noticed some strange audio down there. If you're on lower sideband, it sounds like they're on upper. You go to upper, and it sounds like they're on lower. Has anybody brought that to your attention? Do you know what it is?
What frequency?
It's kind of all around 3700 area.
I know there was one on 3650, and the field office said they found it and they would take care of it. They didn't say what it was.
I don't know. It just seems to come on when you get on. And we've heard people say it's drug runners and, all kind of stuff.
I know of one instance, several complaints about that one frequency. And the Columbia monitoring station field officer told us that they had located it and it would be taken care of, but that's all they told us.
3713.
I'm not, I don't recall any on 3713, but it could have been the same signal.
Can you comment on the 220 megahertz problem, a repeater in Nashville, Tennessee? Doesn't seem to have been resolved.
Do you have a call sign? That's an ongoing case, so we can't comment on it. We're watching that. The complaints have dropped off, but that was a very active case last fall. And
It's not been just allowed for language of the commission. When you say it's ongoing, something is happening.
Right, that's right.
One of the things I wanted to, kind of follow up on was the question about 80 meters and the upper sideband, lower sideband, things like that. One thing you should be aware of is that, and I think most of you are, is that the convention of upper sideband, above 14 megahertz and lower sideband below 14 megahertz is not specified in the rules. That was a convention that was essentially developed when you had crystals and mixers and the way transceivers were designed, when we had, very heavy iron, not software-defined radios. There's no rule that prohibits someone from using upper sideband on 40 meters or 80 meters. They probably wouldn't survive on 160, but that's another matter. The other thing, too, though, about 80 meters is that internationally parts of that band are allocated to other services. So when skip goes long, you may hear things that are not in ITU Region 2, and you may hear stations that are from other services. You also may hear pirate stations that are, fishing boats that have bought, HF radios and they're using them, but they're not in our jurisdiction. We run into that quite frequently with those bands, particularly around sunrise and sunset, things like that. You'll see, if you look at DX Summit, you'll see spots on 160. It'll talk about, floating buoy with a number or something like that. They seem to hear them. I can never hear them, but they do. And, it's because the band is used for other things too. So just because you hear something out of the ordinary, it may be a result of the stupid factor, but it also may be something that's legitimate that comes off of another service. And, it comes down from our perspective if that's interesting, but it's not something we can do anything about. Okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I live in an association, and in the bylaws, there's nothing saying anything about towers and antennas or anything. So being there's nothing in the bylaws, wouldn't I be able to follow the state county laws? The association hasn't said anything about my tower, but I'm putting up another one. And if they was to say something, there's nothing in the bylaws. I mean, they can't just amend the bylaws to say about the tower, right? I'd still be covered under PRB1, under state and local laws.
Well, okay. You said the magic words. There's nothing in the bylaws. Now, generally, when a homeowners association or, an architectural, review committee or something comes to you and says there's a problem, such as a stain on your driveway, you left your trash cans out overnight, your clothesline was visible from the, the front of the house. I don't know why some of you have clotheslines 30 feet tall. I really don't. Loops of wire going around them. They usually come to you and you violated this rule. Now, and usually they have to point, they point to something. Because, for the most part, remember, these are your neighbors. They don't want to get into a fight with you. They're trying to, keep everyone on the same, the same level in the community. And if they don't have a rule to point to, then, that's kind of your answer. Well, what rule have I violated? And if you haven't violated a rule, I mean, it's a matter between you and them, but that makes it a pretty tough road for them to hoe. Now, if you have a county rule or a county ordinance that says no antennas over 30 feet, then obviously that applies to your property if you're in the county. And they can't change that. They can't waive it. That applies to everything there. But if there's nothing in the ordinance, in your local covenants, and to be honest with you, that's the situation with my property too. We have covenants. We have all these restrictions. I'm not allowed to have horses, cows, pigs, sheep, things like that. But there's nothing in it about antennas. And frankly, it's never come up.
I just wanted to ask.
But PRB1 does not apply to, as I said, it doesn't apply to homeowners associations and covenants and restrictions. If you don't have one there are probably some people in this room that might like to, talk to you about that property. Yes, sir.
I've noticed on your enforcement webpage, there's a huge amount of unlicensed FM broadcast stations with enforcement actions against them regularly. Can you tell me what the fascination is for people to go out there and buy these? A lot of times it's huge transmitters. Most of it is small, but these huge transmitters that must cost a lot of money, and they're not even offshore. I mean, they're easily found.
I don't know what the fascination is, because it's only a matter of time, especially you're going to have other licensed FM stations that complain about it. But I don't know what motivates somebody to do that. In the early days, in the pirate cases, you had people saying that or claiming that the commission had no authority to regulate radio within a state, and that's only been resolved about 1,000 times. And but I don't know I don't see any arguments. A lot of these people just don't respond to the notices that we send them after they're inspected. But you still see a lot of it. I'm surprised too, because you'd think the word would get around pretty fast, but seem to see a couple every month. I got no answers for them.
Can you comment on the 40-meter band restructuring as it pertains to the foreign broadcast stations?
Well, the 40-meter band restructuring, there's a number of things that are factoring in there. Of course, we took the phone band down to 7125, so there was 25 kilohertz more spectrum for phone operation in there. My recollection was that at some time in the not too distant future, when the broadcasters set their broadcasting schedule, as a result of the decisions in the international conferences, the international broadcasters are going to be moving above 7,300. I believe we put that in the rule that we put in Part 97 about that. So it's a combination of things, but really kind of a transition over a number of years, where they move out and the amateur service becomes primary. I think it's 7,100 to 7,200 will pick up initially, and then 72 to 73 will stay as kind of a shared band with international broadcast, but they're going to try and redo the scheduling so that effectively they move above 7,300. So 40 meters is going to get a lot better with time. Yes, sir.
Ever since I've become a shortwave listener back in the 60s, there's something that hasn't changed, and it's the number of stations that repeat numbers in Spanish. Does anybody know what that is? Do you guys know what that is or where it comes from? Nobody seems to know.
I don't know. They've never QSL'd. No, I can't. No, can't help you on that one. Yes, sir.
I've recently had to move back into my mother's house because I couldn't keep my house in Columbus, Ohio. And we live in a bad crime area, so we run a scanner quite a bit. Is there any advice you can give me on a brand of scanner that I won't front end overload on low power on VHF?
Would you try the question again?
I front end overload the scanner for the police calls, which we listen to. I'm in a high crime area in Pennsylvania. and I'm having problem every time, even on low power. I have front end overload on 2 meters. In other words, I overtake the front end of the scanner. Is there a scanner built that has good front end rejection?
I don't know, but I have a feeling on the other side of the hall you can probably find a few.
Is it permissible to record malicious interference and use that recording for evidence?
Yeah. Recommended.
There is an exception in the Communications Act. It's, I believe it's Section 706 of the Act. It's called Privacy of Communications. And it was a section that was enacted at the early part of the century that basically was designed so that radio operators aboard ship or other people that had to relay a message were not able to use, or were not supposed to, and most of them didn't, to use that information or divulge it to someone else like that. And you read through it, but at the very end of it, there's an exception. And it's an exception for the amateur service and the citizens band service. So that the import of it is it does allow the recording of amateur to amateur communications on the amateur bands. And that's really kind of part of the whole mentality we have of self-policing and kind of looking after ourselves and, being able to report, violative communications. But it's an exception right there in the Act. So
there was a time when you had to get permission to broadcast, a permission to record an individual, so they would know that it's being recorded, where I'm coming from.
Okay, well, that's not the amateur service. If you were recording a broadcast station, that's another service, and that, was something else.
Or if the station's recording a phone call.
Yes.
Yeah, that's generally what you're talking.
Yes, sir.
My question has to do with all the new technologies like the D-Star and the Echolink, and wherever they're tying the internet in internationally. If somebody calls in internationally over the internet and brings up, say, an Echolink repeater or a D-Star repeater, are they required in their country to have a U.S. call sign to bring up a U.S. transmitter? Or is that being worked on?
The thing there is you're asking about the statement that I made earlier. We don't regulate systems. When you're talking about internet coming in and someone on a foreign country coming through voice over internet and accessing a repeater and all this other stuff, that's a system. There's pieces of it that are telecommunications pieces that are, common carrier, internet type stuff. It's not ham radio. There's an amateur station transmitting. That's the Part 97 controls. Every station has to have a control operator. So somewhere there's someone responsible for that. Someone's call sign has got to be on that transmission if it's made in an area where we regulate communications. We don't regulate communications in Britain or any other foreign country. So when you're looking at a system, what you have to do is look at the pieces and figure out which pieces are amateur radio, what the station is, who's the licensee, whose call sign is going on this. If it's someone that's not an amateur that can access the station, then there's a third-party issue. You have to look at, do we have third-party agreements with that, with the country? The third-party rules were changed, so in the international regulations recently. So if it's disaster communications, it's treated one way. If it's not disaster, it's treated another way. But basically, we don't design your systems, and we don't regulate them. We look at the amateur radio piece. Now, what's happening with the new technologies, we have a whole bunch of them coming, and some of them have already arrived. D-Star is one. People keep asking, is D-Star legal? The answer is, it's legal if it complies with the rules. So's AM, so's FM, so's single sideband, and all this. We have, things like P25. I don't know what that is. We have APCO 25. That was a standard that was worked out, something in the public service community for public service communications. You have something called Olivia. I have no idea what that is. You have Hellscriber. That's another new one that came out. There's GTOR, PACTOR, all these kind of things. The D-Star is a modulation scheme. If you go to the ICOM website, there's a link to D-Star. It talks about what it is. It's a modulation scheme. We have other modulation schemes, Amtor, Baudot, RIDI, things like this. We don't regulate modulation schemes. We regulate emission types. With the repeater thing and the question about the other bands being used, that's the issue that Northern California Packet has asked us, is the definition of a repeater. And we haven't released the decision in that yet, so that's why we've kind of said, hold on and watch. That will be coming out as to the definition of a repeater. It doesn't have anything to do with D-Star directly, because you have FM repeaters, you have ATV repeaters, you have D-Star repeaters. People that get on a repeater with code practice, that's MCW. The rules for repeaters apply to all repeaters. They aren't technology specific. So when this comes out, it will apply. It is an interpretation that we've been asked for. It will apply to all repeaters.
Well, the question actually was more of a control focus. Is the control operator of the repeater or the echolink or wherever the transmission is beginning on the RF side in the United States? The control operator really didn't bring it up, just like because he's like the other user. I'm talking about take out the internet part, but the person who did bring it up, the amateur from the other country, is not licensed for transmissions in the United States. Is that true?
He may be able to operate under reciprocal operating authority depending on the country. But if there's a U.S. station and it comes up and it has a U.S. call sign on it, you know who the licensee is. And the rules presume that person is the control operator.
All right. He gets his choice.
You have to look at the individual arrangement and see what it is, because if someone has allowed other people to dial in to the system and dial it up and access it, that doesn't eliminate their responsibility for the proper operation of their station if it's their call sign. And you have to look a little more at the detail as to whether or not that person is eligible to be a control operator, and you also have to look at whether or not they are. Yes, sir.
I've noticed over the years that the general noise level, at least where I live and every place I've ever visited, is just becoming more and more elevated unless you're in a very isolated area. And I can attribute a lot of that to Part 15 devices and the TV sets and other appliances. Is there any increased or different enforcement activity going on to make sure that these devices that are emanating these emissions that we all hear are in fact in compliance with the current rules?
Yes, there is, and if you watch our website, you'll see more and more certification cases in Part 15 cases, because there's a lot of junk being sold. And probably now the complaints of interference from a Part 15 device equal the complaints of deliberate interference that we're getting. There's an awful lot of plasma televisions are notorious for that, battery chargers for golf carts and scooters, aquarium heaters, and as we get more and more urbanized, we get more and more of those complaints. And so we are looking at that, but you'll see a lot more action in that regard. And you'll see the field going out. The field just went out to an equestrian farm in Wind Gap, Pennsylvania, and found some ballast transformers that really were operating under the medical part of the rules, Part 18, that don't seem to comply. Now they're testing those. They've sent some of those to the lab, but you'll see more and more of that, and we're going to be faced with more and more of that.
In terms of consumer products, once they're deployed, there's really no remedy other than keeping them from proliferating more of those devices.
Right, and the owner is responsible for that. But as you say, once they're out there, the problem is already there. And in most cases, there won't be an operator around that even notice that. But where there's an amateur operator or somebody that can pick up the noise, it becomes a case. But some of them get really long and drawn out, and a lot of times by the time we get it, there's so much friction between the residential owner and the licensee that they're practically shooting at each other. And so it's very hard to resolve. But a lot of homeowners are cooperative. But in the case of this plasma television, you have an elderly couple that saved up for a long time to get this plasma television, having no idea of any interference problem. But the house next door has a licensee in it being totally torn up by the interference, and you can't remedy that from in a plasma television by toroids and things like that, unlike other televisions. So it's a real mess.
Yes, gentlemen, maybe either one of you can comment what the status is going to be in the near future in regards to 60 meters. Of course, we're in a channelized situation now, limited power, particularly in regards to the ERP. I was wondering if you might have any information where this might change in the near future, where we could actually have a band allocation in that part of the HF spectrum.
Well, there are no proposals that have, come up that would, turn the 5 channels into a band, or what we think of as a band, even 50 or 100 kilohertz of spectrum. The thing is that spectrum is shared with the federal government, and there are allocations. And in a way, this is where we as hams have it so good, and the other radio services are so far behind us, that the government spectrum, for the most part, particularly in HF, is channelized. And there are frequencies assigned to different government agencies for different uses. And obviously at 6 megahertz, we're talking long distance uses. We're talking about, frequencies for the Coast Guard to use, where, other government agencies too. Some of them are used for aircraft operations, all this kind of stuff. And some of the channels are used for digital communications. You hear all kinds of stuff down there that's not sideband in that range. Much of it's encrypted. The only way that an allocation of a band that, as we think of it, could come about would be if the government stations were able to move somewhere else. And that's why the 60-meter thing has really been, a kind of an ongoing discussion between the Commission and NTIA, because NTIA is it's the FCC of the government side. It's part of the Department of Commerce, and they are the group that then coordinates with the government users and makes the assignments, and and some of it, frankly, if you want to tell someone move your operations off this, there's an issue of money. Sometimes it's new equipment, sometimes it's reprogramming other equipment, things like that. But to be honest with you, I don't see anything in the near horizon that is, particularly with what the original decision, where we're going to get a block of spectrum at 60 meters that's 50 or 100 kilohertz for us to use. What is proposed in the ARRL's petition is one of the 5 channels has a lot of interference on it. The Commission, and the ARRL went to NTIA and said, gee, is there another channel we could have that's real nearby this that doesn't have this level of interference? NTIA took a look at what they had, what was available, and they said, yeah, we think we can, this one would work better. So the request was to change the rules to allow the amateur stations to swap one channel for another, but it still would be 5 channels. But the other thing that also was requested, though, is you would be able to use CW and narrowband data on those 60-meter channels, so not just upper sideband in there too. And there may have been a change in the power requested too, but that'll be coming out in a notice of rulemaking and comments and the normal stuff to go with that. Okay, they've opened the doors, which means our time is up and the next group is there. I thank you very much for coming.